So glad that you're here for the third presentation. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. We're on the fourth presentation of Origins, the Evidence, an exciting series that looks at some of life's biggest questions. Questions that lie at the intersection between faith and science. Questions such as, does God exist? Where did life come from? And also questions like, can we trust the Bible and the stories of the Bible? So before we launch into tonight's presentation, which is all about fossils and floods, I'd like to do a very brief review of all the night's topics, but this time we're going to look at that review through a biblical perspective. And I'd like to show you how the Bible texts harmonize with some of the big concepts we've derived from science during each one of our presentations so far. Now you remember the first presentation was beyond the Big Bang, and we saw the universe did indeed have a beginning. And that beginning could not have been the Big Bang. All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning, and that was Alexander Vilenkin. And this is precisely what the first three words of the biblical text claim. In the beginning, Genesis chapter 1, and verse 1. Then, the presentation number 2, the God Code, during our second presentation, we discovered that life could not arise without DNA. Information comes from only one source, and that's intelligent beings. And this opens the possibility that this intelligent being is God. Henry Quasler said that the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. And again, the biblical text, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, says, in the beginning, God, that's an intelligent designer, created our world. In presentation number 3, Nature's Marvels, the evidence points to intelligent design from the simple cell all the way up to the most complex organisms. It's what biologists see every day. Evolutionary biologists have to rub their eyes and keep telling themselves, I know it looks designed, but it evolved. The animal kingdom has irreducible complexity that does not fit the evolutionary model. We have Francis Crick, who said biologists must continually keep in their mind that what they see was not designed but evolved. And again, that matches the biblical text, Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God not only created, but He created the heavens and the earth. In Fossils and Floods, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the biblical claim and really set them up against the evolutionary claims. And we're going to do that tonight through the geological column and the fossil record. And this is what the biblical record says. It says in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, you want to read it with me? For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. And then the Bible says, now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive, and the waters prevailed on the earth, how long? 150 days. That's right. So we're going to look at the flood story. The flood story paints this picture. The flood story paints the picture that sedimentary rock were laid down quickly over a short period of time. So if the flood story is true from the Bible, we should see rock layers that were rapidly laid in water. The geological features on our planet were caused by worldwide catastrophic events if the flood story is true. And we should see catastrophe right there in the rock layers evident. Geology should also show us global water movements in the same direction, no matter where you see those water movements all over the earth. You should also see that the fossils support a recent and rapid burial, and then the fossils support instantaneous creation of animal life. So if the flood story is true, this is what you're going to look for in the rocks, in the fossils, in the earth, to see that the flood story is true. Rock layers forming rapidly in water, geology showing worldwide catastrophe, global water movements in the same direction, fossils support recent and rapid burial, and then you have the fossil record supporting instantaneous creation of animals. Now, the biblical picture of a flood is very different from the conclusion Darwin came to after reading Charles Lyell's book, Principles in Geology. Lyell sought to separate science from the Bible, and in the process, Lyell influenced Darwin to separate from the Bible. His book said that the current conditions on Earth were sufficient to explain all geological features. It denied rapid catastrophic events as major contributors to geological formation. In other words, whatever we see happening with rocks and dirt and our land, whether it's local floods or, wind carrying sandy beaches further and further up, or current rates of erosion, those are what Charles Lyell says we need to use to explain everything in the past. So Charles Lyell says lots of time to form what we see. The Bible says very short amount of time and a catastrophic event that is in harmony with what we see today. So, according to Lyell, Darwin, and modern geologists, the geological layers and formations we see today, the layers of rock were formed over millions of years, according to Lyell and Darwin. You should also see rock layers formed without catastrophe. Any floods would have only been local, not global or worldwide. Evolution should be displayed in the fossils. You should see gradual changes with natural links between one fossil group of species to another, and instantaneous creation should be absent from the fossil record. So now we have our tests. Flood or fiction test. First, was it global? Is there evidence for a worldwide catastrophic event to describe geology? Was it water? Is there evidence that water moved over the face of the earth? Was it rapid? Was sediment laid down rapidly or gradually? And the fourth question, are there transitions? Does the fossil record support evolution with transitionary forms? These four questions will prove whether or not it was a global flood, like the Bible says, or whether or not, like Charles Lyell says, it's just what happened over millions of years. So we're going to look at these things, and we're going to look at these things first by looking at the Grand Canyon. We begin by taking a look at the layers in the geological column, and one of the best places to see the layers in the geological column is the Grand Canyon. How many of you have visited the Grand Canyon? Isn't it amazing? It's far more grand than you see in pictures. When you're actually standing there, you can really say, wow, this is a Grand Canyon. People have to book years in advance to just raft down the Grand Canyon. You can hike it, but it takes all day to hike all the way down, all the way back. When you look at the Grand Canyon, you see these layers, and they've broken these layers up into segments. You have the Precambrian, the Cambrian. Precambrian, Cambrian, they say it's 500 to 600 million years ago. The Paleozoic, which is just a little higher on the column, they say that's 300 to 600 million years ago. The Mesozoic, that's the area where you find dinosaur bones. Those are the layers of the dinosaur bones. By the way, my wife and I, right after our honeymoon, we flew back From Kauai, as soon as we landed, we got in a car. Guess where we went? Nope, didn't go to the Grand Canyon. We went to Wyoming in a tent underneath forming tornadoes to dig up dinosaur bones. We were out there for a month digging up dinosaur bones. Pretty awesome. I recommend it for a honeymoon. So it was great. We had such huge tornadoes. The winds were whipping across the Wyoming plains so intensely. One night we were laying in bed, and all of a sudden the tent just went wham straight on top of us. Of course, my wife, she jumps up, and then she falls back in her bed, and her head smacks me in the face. And yeah, that hurt. So you have the Mesozoic, which is where you find dinosaur bones. 250 million years ago is what they say. Then you have the Cenozoic, 65 million years ago until today. That's the very top layers of the geological column. But there's one problem. And that is, you know where the complete geological column is found in the world today? You know where it's found? I'll show you. Textbook. That's the only place you can find the complete geological column. You can't find it anywhere else in the world except a geology textbook. Different parts of the earth will have different layers. Some layers you'll find in common in different parts of the earth, but only in a geological textbook can you find all the layers in sequence. Instead, what you'll find all over the earth is gaps in the geological column that are millions of years of missing rock. Where did the rock go? For instance, in the Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon is both magnificent and breathtaking. You can see clear, unmistakable lines indicating layers in the geological column. But the Grand Canyon is missing the entire Ordovician and Silurian layers, representing nearly 100 million years gone. It disappeared from history of the Grand Canyon. So where did the 100 million years go? Geologists would have you believe that those layers were actually laid down, but were completely eroded before the next layer was laid down. But I want you to notice something. Right here at the very top of the Grand Canyon hills, do you see how you have peaks and valleys right at the top? You know what those peaks and valleys were made from? Erosion. See it? Now I want you to look at the layers. Do you see peaks and valleys in between the layers? Or do you see straight lines? Straight lines. So what looks more like erosion? Does that look like erosion? What about that? Does that look like erosion? Can you see the difference? If there was erosion between the layers, we shouldn't see straight lines. You should see peaks and valleys in between all of those layers, just like you see at the very top layer where erosion has obviously occurred through water, through wind. So erosion cannot explain the missing gaps in the geological column. But that's all that geologists have. They say those whole gaps, they were just eroded. You don't get flat lines with erosion over millions of years. So where did the 100 million years go? You know, current erosion rates in the Grand Canyon are 0.5 millimeters per year. But just so you know what this looks like over 100 million years, at 0.5 millimeters per year, you would have moved a mountain that's 31 miles high into the ocean. Mount Denali, the highest mountain in the United States, is in Alaska, and it's 20,000 feet. That's 3.7 miles high. To have 100 million years of layer missing is like completely eroding Mount Denali 10 times. there's no evidence of erosion in the Grand Canyon. Instead, the evidence suggests that this layer of sediment simply didn't get laid down. If you don't think of it in terms of millions of years and you just think of it in terms of sediment that was laid down, the problem evaporates. So how was sediment, and by the way, sediment means dirt, rocks, all of that, how was that laid down? How was the geological column laid down all over the world? Well, one explanation is when you have an underwater flow of mud that rushes over an area, it lays down a layer of sediment over that area. The underwater flow of mud is called turbidity currents. And turbidity currents are how sediment is laid over a large period or a large area. The problem is that in order to lay sediment over a large area like the Grand Canyon has to be what? Underwater. That is the only way that you can get turbidity currents to lay down those layers of mud. On November 18, 1929, there was a huge 48-mile landslide, and it occurred in the Atlantic Ocean. An earthquake off the coast of Newfoundland caused part of North America to slide into the ocean. This huge wall of mud traveled 60 miles per hour and swept over 400 miles of ocean floor, laying down a perfect sheet of mud. Now, this is the most likely way that layers formed. At some point in the past, the ocean floor was lifted up as the continents were flooded with water. As earthquake after earthquake caused multiple landslides to occur, laying massive deposits of sediment over the land and burying everything on the planet. Then, as the oceans receded and the plate movements pushed the continents back up out of the water, the layers that were laid up would have remained, and it would have looked something like this. And so you have the layers forming in water, laying on top of the land, and then as the whole plates are lifted up and the water recedes, those layers remain on top of the land. I'm going to show you an experiment that was done. And geologists have run different experiments, but here is one on turbidity currents that they've done to demonstrate how the geological column was formed.
This tank represents a small cross-section of the ocean floor and includes several hills and valleys. The unevenness of the bottom is exaggerated to make the results of the experiment easier to see. Let's watch what happens when we release a fine-grained sediment into the tank. After several hours, the sediment has settled to the bottom and formed a layer. The layer is not quite horizontal because of the exaggerated unevenness of the bottom. Another load of sediment released into the tank will form a second layer atop the first. In the oceans, such a layer may be only an inch or two thick and may extend for many miles. It might lie undisturbed for centuries before another mass of sediment is loosened nearby, perhaps by an earthquake. But then the new flow of sediment will cover the original layers and form a new one on top. In this way, layer after layer of sediment is deposited on the ocean floor. The sediments will first fill in the low places. Once these have been filled in, the layers deposited on top are horizontal, even though the bottom of the tank was not.
Isn't that amazing? So how were the layers of the Grand Canyon formed? They were formed underwater. Most likely, as earthquakes were happening, as a great ocean covered our planet, those earthquakes released mud currents that would splash a huge bunch of mud over here, a huge bunch of mud over there, and these turbidity currents, like we saw in the mudslide that happened in the Atlantic Ocean, could literally cover hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles with the same layer. Huge sheets of these layers. And as they lay down, notice that just as we see in the Grand Canyon, they're perfectly flat in between the layers, even though each layer is different. Now, another interesting thing to find in the Grand Canyon is that the entire Grand Canyon is laid down in layers that are coarse to fine. The bigger rocks are all the way up to the finer sand. So it's parsed out, coarse to fine. Now, the Cretaceous layer is one layer that is found all over the world, and it is composed mainly of chalk. This chalk is created from the skeletons of plankton that covered the sea floor when plankton die. Geologists have many theories about how this chalk was laid down, from asteroids killing plankton to other theories. One theory that fits is that of a catastrophic global flood that saw mass amounts of plankton die and their skeletal remains turning into large chalk layers, and you find these chalk layers everywhere you go in the world. Meaning, if the flood was there, it was a global flood. The universal layers around the world indicate the entire world was covered with water at one point. Research has been done by Dr. Arthur Chadwick in cataloging the movement of water around the world at different layers. By the way, you know who was teaching my wife and I when we got back from our honeymoon and went out to Wyoming? There was a professor out there. It was this professor, Dr. Arthur Chadwick, who was actually training us that entire month. As we dug up dinosaur bones, we geolocated those bones so that we could plot them all out on a map, exactly where the bones were facing, where the bones were positioned, how deep they were positioned. And you know why we were doing these 3D renderings of where the bones were positioned in the earth? Because he is the leading scientist on paleocurrents. Not only paleocurrents, but also showing how fossils were laid down in water. And if all the bones are facing the same direction, what does that mean? That means that a global flood or water laid these bones as it was flowing all in the same direction. We're going to get to Dr. Arthur Chadwick in just a moment. But I want you to look here at the sand. Can you tell which direction the wind was blowing? From right to left. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? So we see that the wind is blowing from right to left. You don't have to have, you wouldn't have to have been there to actually feel the wind, because you can look at the evidence in the sand for which direction the wind was blowing. And there is evidence that is left in the rock layers that show us which direction the water was running when the rock layers were put down. Isn't that amazing? And here it is in North America. Across the entire continent of North America, Dr. Chadwick found that during the Precambrian layer, that's the very bottom layer of the geological column, right down at the very base layer, the water did not display any significant patterns. Water flowed into basins, down into valleys, or off the continent into the ocean on both sides. Nothing significant in the Precambrian layer. However, when he goes to the next major layer, which is the Paleozoic layer, there was a definite shift. There was massive and uniform movement of water straight across the entire continent from northeast to southwest. And he took sample rocks He took samples from rocks in the Paleozoic layer all over the United States. As we were digging bones, he was telling us about how far he had to drive to the next sample. He said, I just drove for months and months taking these samples, northeast to southwest. And then in the next layer up in the Mesozoic, Dr. Chadwick cataloged a massive and uniform switch in the direction of the water. The water in this layer uniformly traveled from west towards the east across the entire continent. The next layer up was the Cenozoic, and again, the direction of the paleocurrents returned to what was in the pre-Cambrian layer and what we would expect today. There was no uniform pattern. The water ran off into basins and valleys and off into the ocean on both sides. This indicates that over North America, the entire continent experienced being covered with a massive amount of water flowing in the same direction, and then in the next layer, a sudden reversal in the layer above it until the water lowered and normal water flow again was observed. So that was in North America. Guess what they found in South America? Exactly the same thing. In the Paleozoic, it went from northeast to southwest, and in the Mesozoic, it went from west to east, just as you found in North America. What does that mean? That means that a massive amount of water flowed across North and South America, all laying down one layer from northeast to southwest, and then in the very next layer, the waters receded and moved the other direction across two continents. That's almost worthy of jumping up and down with excitement. It's an incredible evidence that supports a massive flood that moved over both North and South America. Now, what about time? The next question is, how fast did all of this happen? How fast were the layers laid down? Did it really take millions of years to lay each rock layer? How old are the rocks and the bones in the rocks? Well, Darwin thought that soft-bodied animals could not be fossilized because they wouldn't survive millions of years required for the fossilization of bones. However, we find jellyfish, sea anemones, sponge embryos, and other delicate soft-bodied creatures all preserved in the fossil record. How do you have a jellyfish sitting around for millions of years without rotting enough to fossilize? How do you have a jellyfish do that? I mean, go to the Oregon coast today. You'll see jellyfish being picked apart by seagulls. They don't even have time to rot. Those seagulls, eat them up for lunch. So you just can't have it that way. They even have fossilized raindrops right here. Here's a fossilized stingray with the flippers, with the fins still there. Fossilized jellyfish right here. Here's another creature that has been found in the fossil record. It's called the Ediacaran biota, and the preservation of these fossils is one of the great fascinations to science. As soft-body organisms, they would normally not fossilize. The Ediacaran biota is not found in just one place. Instead, they are found all over the globe. China, North America, South America, everywhere, soft-bodied. And this indicates a global catastrophe wiped them out suddenly, not over millions of years. There was something very different about these delicate creatures to be left behind, and it is thought the fossils were buried rapidly. Whatever happened, it had to have happened rapidly. It had to have happened globally, and it had to have happened in water. So why did geologists say that fossils are millions of years old and took long periods to fossilize? Well, it's because the rocks that they find these fossils in are supposed to be millions of years old. How do scientists date rocks? Are their dates accurate? You know, today we know through observable evidence that petrification or fossilization does not take millions of years. Just over 200 miles north of London, England, in a tourist natural well, they are able to encase teddy bears and other items in stone in just a few months. You can go to this shop and buy teddy bears encased in stone, or bring your own to encase in stone naturally. It's called Mother Shipton's Cave. Hats left in mines have fossilized. Bags of flour have fossilized. Fossilization could have happened very, very rapidly. Here's one of those fossilized teddy bears. Let me tell you, you didn't have teddy bears back in the days of Noah. So how do scientists date the rocks that fossils are found in? Well, they use something called radiometric dating, which looks at radioactive elements such as uranium-238. Uranium, for example, will slowly decay into lead-206. The amount of time for exactly half of a radioactive substance to decay is called its half-life. And that's where you get that term. And so radiometric dating relies on measuring the half-life of elements. Uranium's half-life is 4.5 billion years at current rates. So in 4.5 billion years, a completely pure amount of uranium will now be half lead and half uranium. But there are some assumptions made in radiometric dating that throw the numbers off. The first assumption, radioactive material was 100% pure or uncontaminated in the beginning. That's the first assumption they make. If you have it partially contaminated with something else, then it's going to throw your numbers off by millions or billions of years. Another thing scientists rely upon, scientists today have discovered that radioactive elements can decay at different rates depending on their distance from the sun. If you had a clock that sometimes had a minute hand that spun fast and sometimes slow, would you trust that clock? Not at all. You'd have a useless clock. And then the third problem is that rock minerals dissolve in water. So you may not have your full amount of your substance left over if it was in water for a long period of time. What if the rocks themselves were covered in water and some of the radioactive material was dissolved out of the rocks before the rocks could dry? Let's say that you had a 1-inch block of uranium and you threw it into a big lake for a year, and a geologist comes along 1 year later and pulls out your uranium, and unbeknownst to him, half of the uranium has dissolved in the lake. Well, he looks at this half-inch of uranium and measures the amount of lead and discovers, wow, this thing's 4.5 billion years old. Because that is the half-life of uranium. Mount St. Helens in Washington, an opportunity came along to test the radiometric dating. Mount St. Helens blew up in 1980, and in the crater where this volcano had erupted, a huge mound of cooled lava formed called a lava dome. The actual rock was called dacite. And in August of 1993, samples of the lava dome were taken and submitted for potassium-argon analysis. The only information provided to the laboratory was that the samples came from dacite and that low argon should be expected. The laboratory was not told that the specimen came from the lava dome at Mount St. Helens and that it was only 10 years old. What would the laboratory date these rocks to? Well, the rocks that should be newly formed with too little radioactive decay to detect, the report came back 2.8 million years old. But the rock was only 10 years old. And so this really showed that the dating was way off. The problem is worse when various radioactive elements are used to date the same rock. Here you have the Cardenas basalt high up in the Grand Canyon. It's been dated by geologists to be 1.5 billion years old using samarium, which decays to neodymium. You got to pray for me. All of these words kind of switch up my tongue. neodymium. However, when the same rock's age is calculated using rubidium to strontium, the age is 1.1 billion years old. But if you use potassium to argon, the age drops to 516 million years old. So, you get to choose. Is that layer 1.5 billion years old? Is it 1.1 billion years old? Or is it only 500 million years old? That's a large discrepancy, wouldn't you say? And yet, depending on which one of these radioactive material you use to date that layer, you could come up with a date that's over 1 billion years difference. 1 billion years of discrepancy in the same rock. Can you trust radiometric dating? Then you have carbon-14 dating, and this is another form of dating used to date mainly organic material found in rocks or buried in glaciers. It's called carbon-14. Carbon-14 is made in the atmosphere, absorbed by plants, and accumulates in the human body until death. The ratio between carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the body will be the same as in the atmosphere up until a person dies. When something dies, it no longer absorbs carbon-14, and the carbon-14 begins to decay. The half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years. It becomes unreliable after a few 10,000 years. It cannot be used to date things millions of years old. In fact, after several thousands of years, all carbon-14 would have been completely decayed from a substance with none left. So why is there carbon-14 left in items found in rocks that are supposedly millions of years old? Coal samples are found throughout the geological column, supposedly indicating that millions of years exist between the coal samples, and yet they all contain carbon-14. This shows that the coal was buried at some time in the recent past. Fossils with living tissue. You know, in 2005, Mary Schweitzer uncovered a revolutionary find in Montana, the next state over. T-Rex leg bone with soft tissue still preserved. And yet it dated to millions of years. How did soft tissue survive millions of years? Mary Schweitzer said in 2009 on PBS, she said, when you think about it, the laws of chemistry and biology and everything else that we know say that it should be gone. It should be degraded completely. And yet, there it was. Not only did it survive millions of years, the blood vessels were still stretchy. And they believe they have found remnants of DNA. Their explanation? I don't know. So they did an experiment. They used ostrich blood vessels placed in water, and they found that the ostrich blood vessels placed in water decayed within days. Completely dissolved within just a few days. So they thought to themselves, maybe it was in an iron-rich solution. Maybe the iron in the blood vessels helped them to preserve. So they placed another ostrich blood vessel in an iron-rich solution, and it was still recognizable after 2 years. Still recognizable means that a big chunk of it was dissolved or decayed. Does this prove a vessel can last millions of years? Because it was still recognizable after only 2 years? There is a big difference between being able to preserve something for 2 years and being able to preserve it for 2 million years. Soft tissue has been discovered from T-Rex, Triceratops, duck-billed dinosaurs called Diplatosaurus, and from the eggs of sauropods, all indicating that these dinosaurs were buried recently rather than millions of years ago. This is evidence of a recent burial. Now let's look at more evidence of a rapid burial in water, and we're going to look at fossilized trees. Around the world, you can find fossilized trees. Even Charles Darwin came across fossilized trees, some standing vertically in the rock. Darwin sought to explain these trees he saw fossilized vertically in the rock and having been buried gradually over millions of years as they grew. The problem is that these trees had no roots, no limbs, and no bark. If the trees were buried gradually over millions of years, where did their roots go? Where did their limbs go? And where did the bark on the trees go? So scientists were completely puzzled over this. Well, we know that these trees were fossilized gradually over time as all of the forest floor matter built up. We just don't know where the limbs went. We don't know where the bark went. We don't know where the roots went until Mount St. Helens eruption. Let me tell you, that eruption has unraveled so many clues for scientists. In the Mount St. Helens eruption, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of trees that were blasted off the mountain, and these trees all were carried down by mud flows and lava flows into Spirit Lake, where they floated for months. As the trees floated on open water, guess what they did? They rolled. And as they rolled up against each other, guess what got knocked off? All the roots, all the branches, and all of the bark. After several months of rolling around on the water, guess what the trees eventually did? They sank to the bottom. And many of those trees sank vertically to the bottom. About half of the trees sank horizontally, about half of the trees sank vertically, and they sunk into the mud at the bottom of Spirit Lake, and many of them are still there today. Amazing. Both scuba divers and sonar recordings have verified that many of the trees sank vertically and still stand vertically on the bottom of the lake. In a small section of the lake, the sonar was able to detect 154 vertical trees, 95 horizontal logs. Mystery solved. This shows what Darwin saw and what geologists see in the fossil record happened rapidly. It happened in water, where the logs floated in giant rafts for some time before sinking, and the fossils also testified to the trees being buried rapidly. Trees won't last millions of years unburied by sediment. To prevent rotting and decay, the trees have to be buried as they sink. They must sink into soft sediment in the bottom. And this is exactly what we observe. But with all the above evidence, perhaps the largest blow to Darwin's theory of evolution, and one of the evidences that supports a flood model, is the missing transitional fossils that are supposed to exist all the way up the geological column. Here's what Darwin said. He said, "Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory." In other words, Charles Darwin said when he looked in the fossil record, he could not find the slow, gradual transitions between all of the fossils. And he said, that doesn't exist, I can't find it, and this is perhaps the biggest objection to my theory of evolution. Another thing that you find in the fossil record, or that you don't find, is there is no primordial soup. All the way down the geological column, no primordial soup has ever been found, despite millions of years of its supposed existence. But just above the Precambrian layer, right there at the bottom, exists what could be called the Big Bang of the fossil record. It's called the Cambrian explosion. What's the Cambrian explosion? The Cambrian explosion represents one of the lowest levels of the geological column where complex life suddenly appears. You go from the Precambrian world of hardly any life to suddenly the Cambrian world of very complex forms. What do you find in the Precambrian layer? Well, you find things like trilobites. And I've dug these things up in Tennessee. Some guy told me, listen, if you want to dig up a bunch of trilobites, go to this little area. And he gave me the coordinates for it. I put it in my GPS, found it, and I was there for 4 hours digging these little creatures out. Now, the neat thing about trilobites is that trilobites suddenly appear, no transitions, and they have these marvelous compound eyes, each with 15,000 lenses in each eye. So they're complex creatures. They had sensory pits to detect vibrations. They had numerous legs like centipedes. They could roll up in a ball. And they're as complex as modern-day crabs. And it fills the Cambrian layer. You can find them all over the world. They have these trilobites in China, South America, all over the world in the Cambrian layer. Another thing you find in the Cambrian layer is this little guy called the prickly Hallucigenia sparsa. It's a long tubular organism with 7 or 8 pairs of legs with claws and spikes above each leg. Complex, not a simple creature. And then you have the spiny Wiwaxia, a strange creature covered in scales and spikes. It is said to move like a snail with one big foot underneath, like a slug. And then you have the Herdia victoria. Its head bore a pair of spiny claws to move food to its mouth. It had large gills and a spike on the end of its nose. And then you have the giant Anomalocaris canadensis. This creature had large scales. It would flap in the water like fins. The body had 11 lobes, a large head, a single pair of large compound eyes on stalks comprising approximately 16,000 lenses in each eye. It had an unusual disc-like mouth. It had 2 large arms with barb-like spikes in front of the mouth. The tail was large and fan-shaped, and it also had gills. Again, suddenly appears in the Cambrian layer. There's nothing before it. And then all of a sudden, boom, you have this Anomalocaris canadensis, so complex you can hardly say its name. And then you have the Opabinia. This thing looks like it's out of a sci-fi movie. The Opabinia was a soft-bodied animal. Again, soft-bodied. How was it preserved in the fossil record? It had 5 eyes, a mouth under the head, and the mouth was facing backwards, a long tongue that probably passed food to its mouth like an elephant. How did each of these unique creatures evolve? There's just no record of these creatures evolving. They all suddenly appear fully formed with no transitions. Stephen Gould said the Cambrian explosion was the most remarkable and puzzling event in the history of life. Nothing distressed Darwin more than the Cambrian explosion. Darwin said, no organism wholly soft can what? Can be preserved. Darwin thought that all the transitional animals were soft-bodied. And that was why he thought there's no transitions in the fossil record, because all the soft-bodied animals were wiped out. Have we seen soft-bodied animals in the fossil record? Absolutely. Today we know that is completely false. As has been mentioned before, we have fossilized jellyfish, worms, fossilized raindrops and ripples, many other soft-bodied creatures that have been perfectly preserved throughout the geological column. All of the known body plans seem to have appeared in the Cambrian radiation, according to evolutionary biologist Rudolf Raff. Dr. Raff means all the basic body structures suddenly appear without any transitions between them. Vertebrates, those that have backbones, arthropods, those are hard skeletons on the outside and soft on the inside. And then echinoderms, which are sea urchins and starfish. All of the major animal body plans are present in the Cambrian layer. Precambrian, right at the bottom, nothing. Cambrian layer, every body plan that you have that's going to be represented all the way up the fossil record. Incredible. Now, some have theorized that all the transitionary forms were destroyed before they could be fossilized by the harsh Precambrian conditions. But what we find in the Precambrian are sponge embryos. And if you can preserve something as fragile as a sponge embryo, why wouldn't you in the same layer of rock preserve transitional forms of a trilobite? Precambrian sponges had 4 or 5 cell types. How do you go from that to a Cambrian trilobite, which has at least 10 times that many different cell types? You need a vast amount of new genetic information. And where does all that information come from? Plus, today, you have what we call living fossils. Here's a coelacanth. It's a fish, supposed to be 400 million years old. You find it in the fossil record. You also find these huge dragonflies, 350 million years old. They say that some of the dragonflies they found have had 5-foot wingspans. Huge dragonflies. You have here a horseshoe crab, 450 million years old. Here you have the I got all these names going through my head. Jellyfish. Right here. This one was fossilized. They say it's 150 million years old. And yet, you find this fossil, 400 million years old. This fossil down here, horseshoe crab, alive today. Dragonflies, alive today. Look exactly like the ones in the fossil record, but they're a little bit smaller. Then you have the coelacanth. This is caught off of the coast of South Africa. Prehistoric fish. Still alive today, still swimming around. You can find them in aquariums as well. Prehistoric fish. In the fossil record, alive today. And then you have the jellyfish. Jellyfish, of course, still alive today. Archaeopteryx was supposed to be the missing link between birds and reptiles. Some say it is the missing link. In the fossil record, you can see that it clearly had feathers, but what did it look like? Well, you can't quite picture it. A few years ago, one was unearthed with a sternum and wing structure as developed as any modern-day bird. This has led many evolutionary scientists, including the late Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard and Niles Aldridge of the American Museum of Natural History, both militant evolutionists, to conclude that Archaeopteryx cannot be viewed as a transitionary form. They all agree it's just a bird. And then you had Ida. Ida was supposed to be the missing link between primates and early ancestors. However, many paleontologists don't buy it. They believe Ida is more like a lemur. Our analysis, they said, our analysis and results have convinced us that Ida was not an ancestor of monkeys, apes, or humans, and if anything, has more relevance. For our understanding of lemur and loris origins, said Eric Seifert. And because Ida didn't have the grooming teeth of modern lemurs or a grooming appendage of modern lemurs, scientists thought that she must be a missing link. But everything else connects Ida with a variety of lemurs. Then you have Pugila. Pugila was supposed to be the ancestor of seals and walruses. Richard Dawkins excitedly exclaimed, "Pugila neatly straddles the gap between land and water in the ancestor of pinnipeds. It is yet another delightful addition to our growing list of links that are no longer missing." That was until they discovered that Pugila did not possess flippers. Its feet were probably webbed. It had a long tail, and its limbs had the general proportions similar to a modern-day otter. And the postcranial skeleton, everything other than the head of Pugila, appears most similar to that of the living North American river otter. Pugila? Missing link? No, it's just an otter. And then you have Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik was supposed to be the missing link as well. It had the head like an alligator with arms and lungs and eyes on top of its head and a long tail for swimming. It dated to 375 million years ago. Richard Dawkins, in the book The Greatest Show on Earth, claims Tiktaalik is the perfect missing link. Perfect because it almost exactly splits the difference between fish and amphibian, and perfect because it is missing no longer. However, this perfect missing link became a total disaster when it was discovered that the four-legged creature it was supposed to give rise to already existed. Footprints of a four-legged creature found in Poland, dated by evolutionists to 397 million years. Tiktaalik was its own unique creature with no evidence it evolved into anything else. Today, we have creatures alive that mimic some of the features of Tiktaalik. They are called mud skippers. They use their front and hind fins to walk on land. They aren't considered an intermediate of anything, just a different type of species. So what was Tiktaalik? A gigantic mud skipper. Then they had Piltdown Man. He was discovered in 1912 and exposed a hoax in 1953. Nebraska Man, they discovered an ancient tooth and later discovered that it was really the tooth of an ancient pig. Then you have Ramapithecus. The encyclopedia has this to say about it. It said for a time in the 1960s and 70s, Ramapithecus was thought to be a distinct genus that was the first direct ancestor of modern humans, Homo sapiens, before it became regarded as that of the orangutan ancestor. So it's just a orangutan. The next thing that you have is global flood stories. One argument used against the flood story is that it was borrowed from earlier mythical legends. And that sounds good, but what do you do when everyone is telling the same thing around the globe? What do you do? What do you infer if everyone, regardless of who told the story first, if everyone is telling the story? You find more than 200 flood stories all over the world. And these flood stories, 88% of the flood stories, there's a favored family. 95% of the flood stories, it is a catastrophic flood. 95% say it was a catastrophic global flood. Of all the flood stories, 70% of them say that the survivors got away in a boat. 67% say there were animals that were also saved in the boat. 57% of all the flood stories, the survivors land in the mountains, just as the Bible says about the global flood. So was there a global flood? Let me share with you the oldest living things on earth. This is Welwitschia. It grows in South Africa. Some of these Welwitschia plants are 2,000 years old. Here's an olive tree in Greece. They've dated the olive tree to 3,000 years old. Here's another tree. It grows in Wales. It's called the Langernew yew. 4,000 years old. Here's the Sarv bark. It's the oldest living thing in Asia. It's a tree in Iran. It's 4,000 years old. But do you know what the oldest living thing on earth is that's still alive today? The bristlecone pine. It's the oldest tree on earth, and it dates to 5,000 years old. Now, how far back does life go? 5,000 years. precisely when a biblical flood should have receded, exposing the earth to new plant growth. The oldest living thing, 5,000 years ago. Probably that seed was planted 5,000 years ago when the waters of the flood receded and it began to grow. And it's the one thing that's still growing today from 5,000 years ago. It doesn't look very pretty, but that's it. Okay, so what have we learned? We've learned that geological layers were laid down rapidly by turbidity currents. We've learned that the geological column only exists complete in a textbook. We've learned that the global flood is verified by paleocurrents. We've learned that there is evidence of rapid burial with the soft-bodied organisms that had to be buried quickly. We learned rapid fossilization. There are teddy bears that are fossilized in just 2 months. We have radiometric dating, which is unverifiable, with the assumptions that it's made. We have carbon-14 dating, which doesn't date things to millions of years. It's only thousands of years. We have living tissue found in T-Rex fossils with cartilage that is still stretchy, blood vessels that's still stretchy. We have fossilized trees that show rapid burial in the Mount St. Helens destruction. You have no primordial soup in the fossil record. You have the Cambrian explosion, where all animal plants suddenly appear complex. You have living fossils showing animals unchanged up until modern time. You have missing links that are either false or fraud. You have flood stories worldwide, and the oldest living thing on planet Earth is 5,000 years old. All of this shows us that there was a global flood, just as the Bible predicted. And friends, if you can believe the Bible, if you can see that the Bible is true, why wouldn't you read it? And so our next presentation, our final presentation, is going to look at archaeology showing that the Bible is true. And if the Bible is true, maybe it's a plan for your life and my life. So we're going to take a quick break. During the break, there are several things that you could sign up for. November 1 through 3, we're going to have another special weekend called Revelations Rapture, Israel, the Temple, and the Antichrist Revealed. Steve Wohlberg and myself will be presenting that together. It's going to be an exciting weekend on Bible prophecy. We're also going to be starting a Bible study class where there are free Bible study lessons that take you through Bible prophecy, one lesson at a time. It's great. You can sign up for those outside on the table. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back in for our final presentation.